Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to dive into one of my favorite topics, the Wars of the Roses. This is really at the tail end of the Wars of the Roses. Many people mark this event as the end of the Wars of the Roses in England. It's the Battle of Bosworth, 1485. It actually took place on August 22nd, I think. So this week's the anniversary. And some people call it the Battle of Bosworth Field. Regardless, it took place in near a place called Market Bosworth, which is very near to Leicester in central England. So I won't say too much more than that, just because I'm sure they'll get into a lot of the background. Kings and Generals does a fantastic job of setting the stage and telling you about all of kind of the pieces that are moving that get you to the place. So I expect the same here. I haven't seen this video yet. There's a link in the description that will take you to the original content if you want to check them out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive in.
English King Edward IV had shown his mettle in battle and tactical acumen by winning the battles of Towton, Barnet and Tewkesbury.
And Towton is generally considered to be the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The estimates range wildly, but it's in the tens of thousands of dead in that single day. And it was a snowstorm that day. It was really ugly conditions, but pretty nasty battle that for a time at least kind of put an end to the argument over the throne. This is basically the House of York, the House of Lancaster, that whole bit. We'll see how much he covers before I do too much more.
Still, his House of York was facing many adversaries, both domestic and foreign. Edward and his successors had to continue fighting to keep the throne, as the Wars of the Roses were far from over. Everything would have to be decided at the Battle of Bosworth.
So it's important to note the terminology here, Wars of the Roses. This is not really just one single conflict. A lot of times people call it the War of the Roses. This is really multiple conflicts across a couple of different generations involving a lot of different people. It really starts with a guy named Richard, the Duke of York, who has a strong claim on the throne. It's him against King Henry VI. You could really trace the whole thing back much further than that. It goes back to the death of Edward III, and who dies after his son Edward the Black Prince, leaving the throne to his grandson Richard II. Richard II ends up having to abdicate in favor of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, and that kind of plants the seeds for the House of Lancaster, and eventually the House of York is going to challenge for the throne. And when Richard, Duke of York, is killed during the early battles in the Wars of the Roses, his son Edward becomes Edward IV after winning for a time those battles.
Before we start our video, we would like to thank our sponsor, Wix. Wix is everything you need to create a beautiful personalized site with solutions for every need, be it business or personal. We were able to build a site for our channel using Wix's advanced editor, and you can see it at kingsandgenerals.org. On this site you'll be able to see all of our social media feeds in one place, be able to support us, contact us, buy our merchandise, or subscribe to our email list.
Nice.
By visiting our site, you will be able to find all things Kings and Generals in one place. Support our channel.
Should note, not related to Wix at all, but vloggingthroughhistory.com is in the works. That site will be up very soon.
And build your own site by clicking on the link in the description or by entering the URL wix.com/kingsandgenerals. On the 4th of May, 1471, King Edward IV of the House of York decisively defeated his enemies from the House of Lancaster at Tewkesbury. Most of the Lancastrian leaders, among them Prince Edward and Edmund of Somerset, were killed.
So Prince Edward is the son of Henry VI. The throne's been kind of going back and forth a little bit between Henry VI, who's the Lancastrian king, and Edward IV. Edward IV wins, comes to the throne for 10 years or so, maybe 7 years, I can't remember. It's about a decade. And now there's this one last chance for Henry VI when a guy switches sides. A guy known as the Kingmaker, who has very, very strongly been on Edward IV's side, but he switches sides. The Earl of Warwick switches sides, and actually on that side kind of as well is Edward IV's brother, the Duke of Clarence, George.
While the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, became captive. The king knew that some Lancastrian allies, chief among them Jasper Tudor, were active in Wales and northern England, so he moved his troops to Coventry to prevent these enemies from uniting their forces. Meanwhile, one of the last representatives of the Neville family, Thomas, landed in Kent and started recruiting troops on his march to London.
And when I mentioned earlier, a minute ago, the Earl of Warwick, he's a Neville. That's his family as well.
By the 14th of May, he had 15,000 under his command and was attacking London, which was critical both as the capital and the place the Lancastrian king Henry VI was kept prisoner. The Londoners supported the Yorks at this point, and not only sent messengers to Edward IV, but also repulsed all the attacks of Thomas Neville. Edward was fast as usual and entered London on the 21st of May. On the same night, Henry VI was executed, and Thomas Neville, who learned about this and the loss at Tewkesbury, retreated to the south.
I wouldn't call what happened to Henry VI an execution. He was murdered. He was in the Tower, and he had been held prisoner. And Edward IV had been very lenient with Henry VI as an anointed king. He had had other opportunities that he could have killed him, but he didn't. But now at this point, it's like, okay, this has gone on long enough. We've been fighting this for a decade or more. A lot of people have died. Edward IV's father has died in these wars. His brother has died in these wars, killed by one of my ancestors, John Clifford. But anyway, he's lost a lot of family members. And actually, in this last round of things, he also is going to lose his father-in-law, and I think one of his brothers were executed during this last round of wars that took place. So a lot of this, and at this point, it's all bad blood at this point. So we don't know 100% for sure who did it, but somebody took Henry VI out at the Tower. It was not an execution. There was no trial, anything like that.
His troops now demoralized, the Lancastrian leader decided to surrender. At the same time, the rebellion in the north also fizzled out. It would be helpful to look at the family tree of the English monarchs at this point. With the execution of Henry VI, the House of Lancaster was exterminated, and the remaining challenger to Edward IV was 14-year-old Henry Tudor, who had a weak claim to the English throne via his matrilineal ties to the House of Beaufort.
So all of this claim that Henry Tudor has on the throne is super, super weak. Basically, you've got this whole line here has been barred from inheriting the throne because of the nature of the marriages involved, and so they had basically already been written off as having no claim on the throne. So that kind of had to be overlooked. You also have on the Tudor side, Henry Tudor's father, Edmund Tudor, is a half-brother of King Henry VI through Catherine of Valois, Henry VI's mother. Once Henry V dies in, I think, was it 1422, 1425, somewhere in there, Catherine has this relationship with this guy who's pretty much a nobody, Owen Tudor. And has these two children, Jasper and Edmund Tudor. Edmund's the older of the two. And Edmund then is the father of Henry Tudor. Margaret Beaufort was like 13 when she got pregnant with Henry Tudor, and she never had any other children despite being married multiple times. So honestly, Henry Tudor's claim is super, super weak, but he's really the only thing they've got left on the Lancastrian side, so they go with it.
Which was descended from the son of Edward III, John of Gaunt. Henry Tudor was with his uncle Jasper in Wales at that point, and upon learning about the events in London, they decided to flee. They were heading to France, which was ruled by Henry's relative Louis XI, but a storm forced them to land in Brittany. Its ruler, Duke Francis II, was willing to use Henry as a bargaining chip in his dealings with France and England, so the Tudors became partly hostages, partly guests in Brittany. Francis rejected the bribes and threats from the English king through the years. Still, England entered a period of relative peace, as Edward had no real opponents. Louis XI traditionally supported his enemies, so when the Duke of Burgundy offered to help with the Old English claim to the French throne with his troops, Edward agreed, and in 1474 they signed a treaty in London. In June of 1475, the English king landed in Calais, but received no support from Burgundy.
So Calais at this point is still held by the English. Remember, it's only been a few generations before this that England owns large chunks of France and even has had a claim on the French throne. Henry V wins the Battle of Agincourt, and there's some other battles that happen. And basically, Henry VI is all set up to where he's going to inherit not only the English throne, but the French throne. But then his father, Henry V, dies when he's like 9 months old. And so when you have a child like that come to a throne, all bets are off. And France sees their opportunity to get out from under this deal where the English king is going to rule them.
Neither Edward nor Louis was willing to fight, so the former bribed the latter by signing the Treaty of Picquigny. During this period, the relationships between the brothers of the English king, Richard of Gloucester and George of Clarence, were tense, and in 1478, George was accused of plotting against Edward and then arrested and executed.
Supposedly drowned in a barrel of wine. They show kind of a fictionalized version of how that probably went down in the TV show The White Queen. But yeah, George, the Duke of Clarence, and he has a couple of children, one of whom is going to be executed when Henry Tudor is king, and the other one, the daughter, is going to be executed when she's an old lady, executed by Henry VIII, who is Edward IV's grandson. And Richard of Gloucester is, of course, going to become Richard III.
As Richard had supported Edward throughout the Wars of the Roses, the king elevated Richard to effectively control northern England.
And he did a good job.
Although Edward was just 40 years old, he became terminally ill in 1483 and soon passed away. There are multiple theories about his death, and even poisoning is not ruled out. But in any case, his 12-year-old son, Edward V, became the king.
Now, it's important to point out here that Edward IV's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, is hated by a good chunk of the nobility in England, including Edward's own family, because she was basically a nobody. And this was the first time in quite a while that an English king had married an English, basically what amounts to a commoner. I mean, she had been married. Her first marriage was to a Lancastrian named Grey, I think John Grey. So yeah, I mean, there were all of these matches that had been set up with him. They were trying to get Edward married to, like, a member of the French nobility and all this stuff, and he chooses to marry somebody he's attracted to instead, and this just doesn't sit well. And so there's been kind of these factions in court. There's the Woodville faction, because Edward IV has been granting titles and significant marriages to his wife's family, her brothers, her sons from her first marriage, and that's actually who Anthony Rivers is. This is one of her brothers, who's now Lord Rivers, I think, because of her father's death in the Wars of the Roses.
With Richard Gloucester as the regent. However, on the way to London, Richard ordered the relatives and closest allies of the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, to be arrested. Edward V and his brother were placed in the Tower of London. Just a few months later, the offspring of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were declared illegitimate, and Richard III claimed the throne.
And this goes back to, there was this claim that, and there may have been some truth to it, that Edward IV had previously contracted to be married to another woman. I think Eleanor Butler was her name. And there's probably some truth to that. And at the time, if you pre-contracted for marriage, you basically were locked into that. And if you broke that off and married someone else, it could be argued that your marriage was illegitimate. And that's what they use here. They get Parliament to basically declare Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to Edward IV as illegal, as illegitimate, and therefore their children are illegitimate. And that includes Edward V and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of York. So that puts Richard III on the throne. He does have a son at this time. He's got one son. He's actually married to the Earl of Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville. But their son's going to die shortly after he becomes king.
The fate of Edward V and his brother is unclear, but they had disappeared, while the legend of the Princes in the Tower became famous.
So the Tudors, of course, are going to spin this as evil hunchback Richard III had his nephews executed so he could have a stronger claim on the throne. It may have happened like that. It may not have. There's just as good of an argument to be made that Margaret Beaufort, who's Henry Tudor's mother, has reasons to make this happen. And she's got an ally in the Duke of Buckingham, who I think may not have been a duke at this time, but Buckingham may have been involved. There's a lot of other possibilities as far as what happened to the princes in the Tower. What I really hope we'll do at some point is we'll get a DNA test on these bones that were found in the Tower of London under some stairs about 100 years later. Because maybe it was 200 years later. It might have been 200 years later. But they found these bones, and they're now in Westminster Abbey with an epitaph that says that they are the bones of Edward and Richard. But we haven't done any testing to really conclusively say if that's the case.
This naked power grab would stir the political situation in England once again. Queen Elizabeth started plotting with the mother of Henry Tudor, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret's new husband, the Earl of Derby, Thomas Stanley, and the Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford, also became part of this plot. In the fall of 1483, Henry Tudor sailed from Brittany, while Buckingham started a rebellion in the west and south of England. However, severe storms prevented Henry from landing in England, while Buckingham was slowed down and not able to unite his forces with other rebels.
Might have been for the best if you're Henry Tudor, because I'm not sure the situation was ripe enough, was right enough, I guess you could say. It wasn't time yet. Everything kind of falls into place in 1485.
Soon the rebels were defeated by Richard, Buckingham was executed, and Henry had to return to Brittany. The English king demanded that Francis of Brittany extradite Henry, but his demands were rebuked, so Richard sent his navy to blockade Brittany. At this point, Duke Francis fell ill, and as his ministers were willing to surrender the fugitive for a bribe, Henry escaped to France. At the end of 1484, Henry publicly promised to marry the daughter of Edward IV, Elizabeth, to unite the dynasties.
So this is important because in the event that Richard III and his son both die or are taken out of the line of succession in some way, the heir to the throne at this point is Elizabeth of York, because there are no sons of Edward IV left. Edward IV's brother George, the Duke of Clarence, his children have been barred from succession because of his attainder, which is basically when he was sentenced for treason, his descendants were removed from the line of succession. So Elizabeth of York is the heir at this point. She was really the heir before Richard III was, except for the whole illegitimate thing. So what you're going to have to do if you're Henry Tudor is you're hedging your bets here that you're going to make your own Lancastrian claim, which is super dubious at best, but you're also banking on the strong claim that Elizabeth of York will have if you can get Parliament to reverse that declaration that Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to Edward IV was illegitimate. So that's all stuff that can happen afterwards, but it's going to be uniting the houses of York and Lancaster, and Henry VIII, their son, when he becomes king, again, he's the second son, when he becomes king, he will be the first undisputed heir to the throne from all of this.
Which strengthened his position in England. Henry received support from the new French king Charles VIII and recruited mercenaries. Back in England, Richard's wife passed away, and the rumours claimed that he wanted to marry his niece, Elizabeth.
True. In fact, in the TV show The White Queen, the night before the Battle of Bosworth, they have a scene where Richard makes love to his niece, Elizabeth of York. There's no evidence to suggest anything like that happened, but those rumors did exist of him wanting to marry her.
This spurred Henry to action, and on the 1st of August 1485, he set sail from France at Honfleur and landed in Wales on the 7th without meeting any obstacles, despite the fact Richard had placed small garrisons to blockade a naval invasion.
So why land in Wales? Well, the Tudors are Welsh. That name is Welsh. It goes back to a guy named Owen ap Tudor. So he's hoping for support there. He's hoping that it's a safe place for him to land and march east and build support while he can.
As Henry had Welsh blood, many local lords joined him, and on the 15th he entered England near Shrewsbury. Meanwhile, Richard learned about the landing on the 11th of August. It took him a few days to gather all his forces.
And you see Stanley here. There's two Stanley brothers. One of them's married to Margaret Beaufort, so he's Henry Tudor's stepfather. The other one is, I think, I forget the first names of the two of them. But one of the members of the Stanley family is actually being held as a captive by Richard III to kind of guarantee the Stanleys' loyalty. They're kind of a third army, like a free agent army that's out there on the side of the battlefield watching this unfold, waiting to decide which side they're going to jump in on.
On the 16th, the Yorkist forces started moving towards Leicester. Although that gave Henry a chance to move towards London, he also marched his troops towards Leicester as he had allies in the area and needed their help to win. Gathering these allies, Henry moved closer to Richard. On the 21st, the armies encamped to the south of Bosworth, with Richard taking Ambion Hill, while Henry stopped at a place called Whitemoors. Thomas Stanley seemingly promised to join both sides, but instead made a camp at a hill called Dadlington to the south of Henry and Richard.
And there's some question about a lot of this. There's even question about where exactly the battle took place, because the place where they have the battlefield marked and there's a visitor center and everything today is probably not where the battle happened. They've done some research, some archaeology, and found a lot of evidence that the battle happened in a slightly different place. And there's some question, too, about exactly where Stanley was during all of this. But, this is all based on who you believe, whose account you believe, what's the best evidence we have out there.
The Tudors had more than 5,000 troops, while the Yorks probably fielded an army closer to 10,000.
Yep.
Stanley's 5,000 were a wild card.
So think about that. Stanley jumps in on Richard III's side. Now you got 3-1 odds. He jumps in on Henry Tudor's side, and you've got an even battle. So it's a big deal. His army is as big as Henry Tudor's.
On the morning of the 22nd, Henry arrayed most of his forces in one large unit, commanded by the Lancastrian veteran of the Battle of Barnet, John of Oxford, while he led a small reserve. The Tudor army...
A lot of times, too, you will see Henry Tudor referred to as Richmond, because he had been made Earl of Richmond by his uncle, Henry VI. There was a title there, and I think in Shakespeare's plays he's often referred to as Richmond.
Army started marching towards their numerically superior enemy. Richard was surprised by this, as he expected Henry to take a defensive stance. The battle was not beginning according to his expectations. Still, he managed to get his army into 3 groups. John of Norfolk commanded the right, Percy of Northumberland the left, while the king was leading the centre.
Ah, the Percys. You see there's some artillery shown here. This is 1485. Cannon are a thing. Guns are a thing. They're not super accurate, and they're not everybody's carrying firearms, but they are a part of this battle.
While the Tudors were getting closer, the Yorkist artillery opened fire upon them. Oxford was prepared for that, and his troops started shifting to attack the left flank of the Yorkist army. This put his main division directly against Norfolk, and the artillery barrage stopped to prevent friendly fire.
So that's what you got to do. You got artillery, which is super inaccurate at this time. We're not talking about rifled artillery that you can hit the barn door from a mile away. This is super inaccurate stuff, firing solid shot. So you close the distance between you and the enemy so they can't use it anymore.
The Yorkists had numbers on their side. Oxford widened his line on the march before the two groups finally clashed. The Tudor forces started to push back their counterparts. At the same time, Northumberland on Richard's left flank wasn't moving in, either due to betrayal or in fear that Stanley, who still hadn't made his move, might attack him from the rear.
So see, even without Stanley actively fighting in this battle, just having him out there causes concern for both armies. It's something you have to be aware of and concerned about and kind of protecting against. So if Stanley had been firmly on the side of Richard III, this battle's probably over pretty quickly in his favor.
Richard needed to turn his centre to descend from the hill, but it was moving too slow, and that allowed the Tudor rearguard to move in and attack Norfolk from the right. Seeing Henry's dragon banner, Richard decided to charge against him with 1,000 horsemen.
So this is where Richard gets brash and makes his fatal mistake. He sees Henry Tudor on the battlefield. He knows, if I can just take Henry Tudor out, this all ends. We don't even have to fight this battle. There's no claim. There's nowhere to go from here. He's the last Lancastrian claimant to the throne. I guess that is true. It doesn't mean he wouldn't have had other Yorkist claimants like his niece, but really he sees the end in sight.
Initially, this charge pushed Henry's forces back, and the unit was close to panic. However, the challenger to the throne stood firm, and his bodyguards managed to stem the tide. Oxford also supported his liege, sending a group of pikemen to attack Richard from the left. This attack started pushing the English king towards the marshes in the southeast. Simultaneously, Stanley sent his younger brother William to join the battle, and he attacked Richard's group from the right. This was the final straw. The knights around Richard started dying, and soon he was killed with a blow to his head.
So you have a little bit of the inspiration here for the Battle of the Bastards in Game of Thrones, where it seems like Jon Snow's side is about to lose, and then the army of the Vale shows up just in the nick of time and turns the tide of the battle. It's not the only time anything like this happened, but there's definitely some inspiration there.
The news of his death ended the battle.
Just like Henry Tudor being killed ends the battle in favor of Richard, Richard III being killed means it's over. Now everybody's thinking about themselves, because if Henry Tudor's going to be king, then he's going to be getting retribution on anybody who took the wrong side in this. In fact, he'll get Parliament to declare the start of his reign to August 21st, the day before the battle. Why does that matter? Because that means that at the Battle of Bosworth, Henry Tudor was King of England and Richard III was the usurper, and anybody who fought against Henry was fighting against the legitimate king. It's really brilliant tactical BS, but it works.
We have conflicting information on the casualties, but it seems that they were relatively low, as the fight took less than 2 hours and was decided in the engagement of two groups of knights. A few months later, the victor assumed the throne as Henry VII, establishing the House of Tudor. Even though the new king had to defeat a number of rebellions and pretenders, the Wars of the Roses were over. The House of Tudor would play a critical role in English history, but that is a tale for another documentary.
So a couple rebellions specifically that Henry Tudor has to deal with. There's one where you have this guy that shows up claiming to be Richard, the Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. And he makes that claim for quite a while, and he seems to convince people that it's true, people who would know, or they were just people who wanted to get back at Henry Tudor, so they were willing to accept his claim even if they knew it wasn't true. And of course, then he gets locked up along with Edward, the son of the Earl of Warwick. Well, not the Earl of... I think he does inherit the Earldom of Warwick, but he's Duke of Clarence's son, Edward IV's brother. It's a lot. I understand that. But there are rebellions. There are claimants to the throne. It happens again under Henry VIII, where you have some of the remnants, the Pole family, who are remnants of the Duke of Clarence's line, George, Edward IV and Richard III's brother, who have to be wiped out by Henry Tudor. You've got Duke of Buckingham, who gets executed and had made some claims about his descent from Edward III. So you're always going to have that, but really this is the last serious fighting that takes place is Bosworth. So it's a fascinating time. It's one of my favorite times in history to talk about. As you can tell, I'm kind of saying a lot here and I'm all over the place. I understand that, but I'd encourage you to check out more. I'll throw up a link in the description to a video I did a long time ago, one of my earliest reactions, talking about the Wars of the Roses as a whole. So you can check that out and get a little bit more of the backstory of what led into this time in history. Please hit that like button if you would. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.